first of all, I want to thank you and thank all of you for inviting me here. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to engage with you over these couple days, and I hope maybe we'll have some additional opportunities to work together. Let me sort of start by framing what I'm going to talk about today. I'm in the sort of middle of a large research project where I'm working across basically the areas where Palestinian refugees have lived, the areas of UNRWA operations, so Lebanon, Jordan, Syria I can't go to now, West Bank, Gaza, to look at the experience of Palestinian refugees living kind of with humanitarian assistance, both from UNRWA and from other organizations, from 1948 to the present, right? So it's across the different spaces and across time. And what I'm trying to consider and investigate in this project is the impact of this long-term humanitarianism on Palestinian community and political life. Now today, in my talk, I'm mostly going to focus on Jordan, and particularly on a refugee camp near Jerash, which is populated by people who came to Jordan from Gaza in 1967. So people who've been double displaced. So their situation in Jordan is distinct from the larger situation. So the issues that I'll be raising in some sense are distinct to this population, but in another sense are general. And I think, as you listen to what I'm talking about, you might also think about how does what I'm talking about in Jordan fit with what you know or what you've experienced here in the West Bank? Where are the points of similarity? Where are points of difference? And that might be something that we can talk about. I'm gonna read my talk, but feel free to interrupt me at any point and say, one, you're going too fast, because I have a tendency to go fast. Or to ask any questions. We can stop and talk in the middle if there's something that you want to hone in on a little bit more. And in any case, we'll have opportunity
and maybe just
to
talk
talk
because
further.
I was asked by them, because this is also known as the refugee Gaza,
Mukhayyam Gaza.
And you asked me if we could give you more information about Mukhayyam Gaza. So for whoever of you that wants more information, here is the more information.
Yeah.
All the time بنلبي طلباتكم. Yes.
بس اسمه مخيم جرش مخيم غزة، يعني عشان نقولهم غزة اسمه.
يعني مسيحيين.
لا
لاجئين.
في أنا بحكي عن هذا، معظمهم لاجئين، بس في شوي منهم لاجئين.
كلهم لاجئين.
معظمهم لاجئين. Okay, so in this project, part of what I'm trying to understand as I'm looking at this long-term experience is what happens as humanitarianism moves from a crisis response, right, from responding to the immediate aftermath of 1948, where people are displaced, unsettled, without food, right, to a condition of life, right, a long-term condition. And humanitarian practice clearly shifts from disaster relief, giving people food, giving people clothing, giving people shelter, to things that look more like social service work and development projects. Part of my question, what I want to understand, is how are people and communities shaped by this transformation and by living long-term in a humanitarian condition? And I want to say, again, that the Palestinian case is distinctive in a lot of ways from other refugee situations, but it is not totally different from them, and including in this notion of long-term. The Palestinian refugee population may be one of the longest refugee communities, but the numbers of people who are living as protracted refugees, which is the UNHCR's term for long-term refugees, is a very significant and growing part of a global refugee population. So another thing we can think about is not just comparing one Palestinian community to another, but also the ways in which the Palestinian experience tells us something about humanitarianism and its effects more generally. Right? It's not so different that we can't learn something that is relevant to other populations. Now, I'm an anthropologist, and there's a lot of interest now in anthropology on humanitarianism. A lot of people have been working on this, and a lot of the literature in recent years. Much of it has been in conversation with the work of an Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben. I don't know if Agamben has come up here, right? But his ideas of bare life have really influenced a lot of the anthropological literature on humanitarianism, which has focused on the limits and ethical constraints of humanitarian action. And this research has explored the ways that humanitarianism maybe can reduce the people it seeks to help to mere victims, objects of compassion, but restricted in their capacity to act as full subjects in their own right. The research has illuminated the hierarchies that are built into a project made up of helpers and victims, where some can choose to make sacrifices to assist the helpless, and other people are themselves sacrificed in other people's wars and conflicts. Now, the anthropological literature, which has looked at the depoliticizing effects of humanitarianism, intersects with more policy-oriented debates about whether humanitarian agencies should take political positions in their work, or whether they should remain neutral, impartial, and non-political in their missions. And this is a big debate within humanitarian communities about the relationship to politics. Now, I think that the focus on how humanitarianism constrains and disables has illuminated crucial dynamics of a field that generally to the public is sort of valorized as doing good. People think about humanitarianism as just a good. And so it's been useful to understand some of the problems with it. But these constraints are not all that needs to be understood about humanitarian effects. And in some ways, I think that my project intersects with what you were talking about, is how do you understand the camp? There are the problems, and that's something that's important to understand, but it's also important to understand what are the possibilities and what are people doing. So what I'm focusing on is what happens kind of within a humanitarian order. And I ask, what forms of action are enabled by humanitarian materials and practices? What kinds of relationships are produced by humanitarian categories and procedures? What are the life worlds that take shape within the humanitarian space and through the humanitarian condition? Right? So not just what is impossible, but what is produced, what is made possible. How do people make use of these things? So to think about the politics of life within humanitarianism, I think I want to step back a bit and say a bit more about what is humanitarianism? How do we conceptualize what this is? Because it is several different things all at the same time. It is, on the one hand, an arena of legal regulation, international law, that's meant to protect civilians and refugees. And that includes the body of international humanitarian law, IHL, refugee conventions, such as the 1951 and 1967 conventions on the status of refugees, and institutions such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which are meant to enact these legal protections. And as I'm guessing everybody is aware, of course, Palestinians have a sort of separate set of institutions, UNRWA, and a separate definition, but it intersects with this broader field. So the legal arena describes humanitarian obligations, right? That states and bodies are supposed to have responsibilities to certain protections for refugees. Now, humanitarianism is also a discursive field in which images of suffering and other emotional tugs circulate and motivate donation to charities and claims for exceptional procedures, right? So people talk about humanitarian needs and ask for people to give or ask for governments to make exceptions to their normal procedures. And this is a field in which humanitarian compassion predominates. So you're asking something of people, but not because the law requires it, but because their humanity should dictate it, right? This is the sort of the discourse of compassion. Now, it's also a form of practice, right? The delivery of emergency aid, the provision of social services over periods of extended displacement, and increasingly the deployment of a diverse range of interventions, things like psychosocial problems, microcredit projects. This project you can see fitting into the kind of more innovative new transformation of what humanitarian practice might be. And the practice involves both obligation and compassion, and I think can highlight the ways in which these forces are in tension. And I'm going to be talking here primarily about humanitarian practice, but I think you can see that you can't totally separate out all of these realms. Now, humanitarianism is also what people often talk about as a biopolitical field. That is a field of governance that is concerned with life, with the management of life. concerned with the welfare of populations, developing techniques for tracking and managing calorie intake, health indicators, educational attainment, social well-being, right? All of these things are concerns of humanitarian practice. It is also biopolitical in the sense not just of fostering life, but sort of the other side of what is of the biopolitical, which is sort of disregarding it or disallowing it to the point of death. Right? These are sort of the two sides, and we can talk more about biopolitics if this is a concept of interest to you. Certainly the laws of war that are at the heart of international humanitarian law are as much about regulating death as promoting life. And Hassan Jabarin, who works at Adallah, suggests that for non-combatants, IHL includes no right to life, but rather the right to a proportional death. Right? So the arena of international humanitarian law doesn't just talk about life and how to protect life, but the ways in which people can be allowed to die, the regulation of that space of death. And humanitarian action in the aftermath of conflict also has this characteristic. Humanitarian work involves the repeated division of populations into those who have access to assistance and those who do not. Right? So there's always a set of decisions being made. And this calculus of life is part of what French anthropologist Didier Fassin describes as a politics of life as such. A politics that involves ascribing values to life as such and to lives concretely. And this is a politics of what he calls bio-inequalities. Right? So it's making a judgment about the value, not just of life generically, but of different lives. So what I want to explore here is how people living in humanitarianism act within and in response to this biopolitical field. That is, not just the politics of life, but the politics of living. And in distinguishing the politics of living from the politics of life, I want to signal that what I'm giving attention to is not just humanitarian work, right, the decisions that are made by humanitarian actors, but to the dynamics of being, right, surviving, claiming, acting, living within it. And in the larger project, I do also look at the sort of work of the humanitarian agencies, look at the politics of life side, because this is, I think we need to understand the relationship between them. But I want to emphasize the politics of living because I think this has been given less attention in the humanitarianism literature. A lot of it has really focused on the sort of calculative work, the way humanitarianism looks out at people and tries to manage them. And I want us to also be able to look at what it is that people do with it, right? Because people don't just accept what's coming at them, but make all sorts of use of these tools. You can never completely separate these two aspects, right? The politics of life, politics of living, because certainly the humanitarian apparatus influences how people live within it, right? Through its work of naming, humanitarianism, so it names victims, it names refugees, it defines who are not refugees. Humanitarianism helps define political actors. It delimits a discursive space of claim making, right? So shaping a field of what I'll talk about as humanitarian rights based in obligation and compassion. And especially in conditions of long-term displacement, humanitarianism also shapes the course of people's lives and therefore their relationships and communities. All right. Now politics, if you want to think about, right, the politics of life, the politics of living, is a problem for humanitarianism, right? Both for providers and for recipients. Because sometimes to advance a political cause or even to offer a political evaluation can mean risking one's status as a proper humanitarian subject, right? If to make a claim, a political claim, one doesn't look like the proper humanitarian victim. But I think, as has been widely shown, politics is part of nearly every humanitarian situation. It can't, despite all these efforts to separate it out, it really can't be. And this general phenomenon has particular inflections in the Palestinian case because of the occupation, the conflict. I mean, I was talking to Sandy last night. There's actually an effort going on right now in the United States Senate to redefine, to try to force the State Department to redefine what a Palestine refugee is as only those people who actually left in 1948. So this is an effort through the work of now, of course, the State Department isn't the body responsible for defining Palestinian refugees, but you see the politics of definition. There's an effort to try to displace a whole set of political claims through redefining the category into, a small number and say all the rest of the people don't have claims. So the ways in which humanitarian categories, humanitarian practice, humanitarian work are caught up in politics is, again, particularly fraught, we might say, or particularly tense in the Palestinian case.